It begins not with snow, but with silence. The fields that once echoed with the calls of laborers and the rhythmic beat of tools now stand still beneath a dull gray sky. A frost clings to the thatched rooftops like a warning. By the time the first true chill creeps beneath the wooden door, medieval peasants know winter has come. In the medieval world, nature did not politely knock. It barged in. Summer's abundance had ended weeks ago. Autumn had been a flurry of preparation, harvesting what little grain could be gathered, preserving meats with smoke or salt if it could be spared, digging root vegetables and hoping the earth had yielded enough. But once the air changed and the sun dipped faster beyond the treetops, the rhythm of life shifted. The world grew quieter, and survival became the only priority. For most medieval peasants, life was lived on the edge of hardship, even in the best of times. But winter pushed that edge closer to the brink. The cold was not simply uncomfortable, it was dangerous. In stone cottages with dirt floors and gaps between the timber, warmth was a precious resource. Fireplaces were crude, usually little more than a central hearth with smoke escaping through a hole in the roof. There was no insulation, no double glazing, no such thing as central heating. Blankets were rare, furs even rarer, and layers of wool clothing had to do the work of keeping entire families alive. The first days of winter were filled with nervous energy. There was still food, some dried beans, barley, salted pork, if you were fortunate. Ale brewed in the fall was still drinkable, and the cellar still held a few sacks of turnips and onions. But everyone knew the rules. Eat slowly, stretch every meal, and waste nothing. The scarcest commodity wasn't bread or salt. It was time. Time until spring. Time until something grew again. As the days shortened, peasants began to measure time not in hours or seasons, but in what was left. How many loaves of bread remained? How many logs by the hearth? How many days could they go without needing to open the last jar of lard? Even children learned to count differently in the winter, not by their age or holidays, but by hunger pangs and fire embers. The cold itself wasn't just a temperature. It was a character, an intruder in every home, a silent predator that slipped beneath blankets, turned water to ice in clay pots, and took the weakest first. Babies, the elderly, the sick, all were vulnerable. A simple chill could become a death sentence if it lingered too long in fragile lungs. And yet, life went on. Chores didn't stop. Animals still needed feeding. Wood needed chopping, even when hands went numb. In some villages, the community helped the oldest or poorest collect kindling, recognizing that in winter, generosity could mean the difference between life and death. There was little room for selfishness when frost crept across every windowsill. But beneath all the hardship, there was a rhythm, a quiet determination passed down through generations. Peasants had no weather apps or warning systems. What they had was memory. They remembered the winter 2 decades ago, when the snow reached the eaves of the chapel. They remembered the year the barley rotted, and the priest said it was God's punishment. And they remembered how their fathers and mothers had endured before them. So they watched the skies. They whispered predictions. They braced for what they knew could be months of darkness, illness, and gnawing hunger. The first frost on the threshold was not a surprise. It was a sign, a whisper from nature. Prepare now. Hold your breath. The hardest season has begun. Step inside a medieval peasant's home, and you won't find comfort, you'll find compromise. These were not houses designed for coziness. They were built for necessity, crafted from what the earth and forest could offer, then shaped by centuries of hardship. In winter, they transformed from shelters into battlegrounds, where families fought silently against the cold with every breath. Most peasant homes were single-room structures, shared by an entire family, and sometimes their animals. The walls were made from wattle and daub, a mixture of twigs woven together and smeared with a muddy paste of clay, soil, straw, and dung. It was surprisingly effective at blocking wind, but not at sealing out cold. Gaps formed with age, rain eroded the base, and moisture seeped in. On especially frigid mornings, frost could form on the inside walls. The thatched roofs were thick and sloped, made of layered reeds or straw bound together and pegged tightly. They were decent insulators until a storm dislodged sections or birds pecked holes through them. In winter, snow could pile on top and weigh the entire roof down. Some peasants had to climb up and knock it off with sticks, risking injury to prevent collapse. Inside, the floor was dirt, packed and smoothed, but uneven. In dry seasons, it turned dusty. In wet months, it became a shallow bog. In winter, it hardened like stone, bitterly cold beneath bare feet. Wealthier peasants might lay down straw or rushes to soak up dampness, but these needed frequent changing, or they rotted and stank. Lice and fleas thrived in the rushes, joining the unwelcome parade of rats and beetles that sought warmth indoors. At the center of it all was the hearth. This wasn't a fireplace as we picture today, but an open fire pit, sometimes sunken into the floor, sometimes elevated on stone. It burned peat, wood, or dried dung, depending on what could be gathered. The hearth was the heart of the home, literally and figuratively. Families cooked over it, dried clothing above it, and huddled beside it. But it was a smoky affair. Chimneys were rare. Smoke exited through a simple hole in the roof, or drifted through the rafters, blackening every beam, coating lungs with soot, and stinging eyes until they watered. Still, that smoky warmth was a precious commodity. People sat close to the fire for hours, hands outstretched, children crammed near their parents, and sometimes animals curled at their feet. When wood was scarce, and it often was, they let the fire die at night and hoped the embers would still be alive by morning, so it could be coaxed back to life. Matches didn't exist. Fire meant life, and losing it meant cold meals, unboiled water, and long, dangerous nights. Sleeping arrangements were communal. Beds were usually straw-filled sacks or piles of cloth on wooden frames, if not directly on the floor. A family of 6 might sleep together for warmth, layered in whatever cloaks or sheepskins they possessed. Privacy was non-existent. You shared dreams, snores, coughs, and body heat. Babies slept with mothers. Grandparents curled beside children. Even if tensions rose during the day, at night everyone drew close. Windows were small and few. Most were just holes covered with animal skins, parchment, or wooden shutters. Glass was unheard of in peasant homes. Light during the day was faint, especially in winter. At night, it came from firelight, tallow candles, or oil lamps, if you could afford them. Most simply sat in the dark, voices soft, eyes watching shadows flicker across the walls. And yet, despite the darkness, the cold, the dirt, and the discomfort, these homes endured. They were ugly, fragile fortresses, but they stood, and year after year, peasants returned to them like nests, patching, repairing, and surviving, one freezing night at a time. When winter came, medieval peasants didn't reach for fleece-lined coats or down jackets. They reached for layers, thick, itchy, heavy layers. In a world without modern insulation, clothing wasn't fashion, it was survival. Every garment was a barrier between warm flesh and the cruel, gnawing chill of the season. And often, what you wore was all that stood between you and death. The first line of defense was the humble tunic. Men, women, and children alike wore a base layer made of linen, if they were lucky. This thin fabric helped wick sweat away from the body, even in winter. Over that came wool, the miracle material of the medieval world. Coarse, scratchy, and thick, wool held heat, even when damp, and was relatively easy to produce. Peasants spun wool themselves from sheep they tended, and the garments were often dyed in muted earth tones, brown, gray, green, from natural sources like bark and lichen. Peasant men typically wore a second, heavier woolen tunic over their base layer, sometimes with a hood attached. Leg coverings varied, hose, breeches, or wrapped cloth strips around the calves for warmth. Women wore long woolen dresses over linen shifts, sometimes layered with aprons or overgowns. The more layers, the better, though movement became stiff and clumsy. Cloaks were the prized outer layer, especially in winter. A good cloak could mean the difference between frostbite and safety. Cut from heavy wool and fastened with a brooch or tied with a belt, cloaks draped over the shoulders like shields. If one had a hood or was long enough to wrap around the body, it doubled as a sleeping blanket at night. In poorer homes, only one or two cloaks might exist, shared, rotated, and handed down for generations. Head coverings were vital. Most heat escapes through the head, and peasants knew this intuitively. Men wore woolen caps or coifs, tight-fitting hoods tied under the chin. Women wrapped their heads in wimples or kerchiefs, layering them for added insulation. Children wore miniature versions, sometimes stitched from scraps, with mothers checking constantly to be sure they stayed on. Footwear was primitive, and winter made it worse. Shoes were often made of leather or felt, with little protection from the cold ground. Soles wore through quickly, especially in muddy terrain. So many peasants stuffed straw or rags inside to pad and insulate. Some went barefoot, even in the snow, out of necessity, not bravery. Frostbite was common. Toes blackened. Limps became permanent. Gloves, if owned, were treasured. Most peasants simply tucked their hands into sleeves or wrapped them with cloth. Mittens were easier to make than gloves, and occasionally shared between family members. Finger dexterity was sacrificed for warmth. But clothes were more than warmth. They were memory. Each patch told a story. A rip repaired by candlelight, a tear mended with picket thread, a hem let out as a child grew. A cloak might have belonged to a grandfather. A cap might have been worn to a wedding 5 winters earlier. These were not disposable items. Clothes were inherited, swapped, turned inside out, and repurposed until they disintegrated. And in winter, clothing rarely came off. Undressing was dangerous. Bathing, when it occurred, was brief, painful, and done beside the fire or in freezing rivers with gritted teeth. Clothes were worn to bed, through chores, and sometimes even layered more if illness struck. Changing garments wasn't a daily ritual, it was a luxury, and sometimes a risk. Despite the smell, the lice, and the chafing, peasants endured. They understood the equation. More layers meant more life. Wool was their armor, linen their shield. and every tied belt or buttoned collar another act of resistance against the creeping death of winter. In the medieval winter, fire was a necessity, a symbol, and a luxury all at once. It was the single most important factor in determining whether a peasant family would make it through the night. A flickering flame was more than warmth, it was protection, light, a way to cook, and a comfort against the howling dark. But keeping a fire alive in the harshest months wasn't as simple as lighting a match. It was labor, it was planning, it was life or death. Wood was the most common fuel, but not all wood was equal. Dry, seasoned hardwoods, like oak, ash, or beech, burned hotter and longer. But peasants often had to settle for whatever they could gather: damp sticks, softwood branches, or even rotten logs. Cutting firewood in the fall was an expected duty, and every villager understood that a well-stacked pile before winter could mean survival later. But not everyone had access to forests. Lords often controlled woodland rights, so peasants risked fines or worse if caught gathering without permission. To get around this, many peasants collected fallen branches or dead wood, anything not technically cut. Others gathered peat dug from bogs and dried into bricks, especially in regions where trees were scarce. Peat burned slower and smelled earthy, but it produced less heat. In some places, dried animal dung was used as fuel, mixed with straw and left to harden. It could be burned for cooking or warmth, though the odor made it a last resort. Once firewood or fuel was secured, the challenge was keeping it dry. Rain and snow ruined kindling. Peasants stored wood under awnings in lofts or inside the cottage, stacked against a wall near the hearth. Even then, damp wood hissed and smoked, filling the house with ice-stinging fumes. The hearth had to be nursed carefully, and a peasant's skill at fire building could mean the difference between warmth and a cold, smoky mess. Lighting the fire was another challenge. There were no lighters, no convenient matches. Instead, peasants used flint and steel, striking sparks onto dry tinder, often moss, straw, or cloth charred beforehand. Some households kept a slow-burning log going continuously, carefully banked with ashes overnight to smolder and then revived at dawn. Losing a fire meant starting over, which could take an hour or more. In emergencies, neighbors might share embers between households, carried in clay pots or wrapped in moss to avoid extinguishing the precious spark. The central hearth, usually a shallow pit of stone or packed earth, had no chimney. Smoke rose into the rafters and found its way out through a hole in the roof or between thatch. It wasn't efficient, but it was the only option. Over time, ceilings blackened with soot, and the air inside turned thick with smoke. This led to respiratory issues, chronic coughing, and watery eyes, especially in children and the elderly. But no one complained. The smoke meant the fire was still alive. Around the hearth, life revolved. People gathered here to eat, sow, pray, and sleep. It was the only warm place in the home, and its flickering glow was the evening's only light. Ashes were reused for cleaning, making lye or insulating storage pits. Fire was not just a tool, it was woven into daily life. But fire was also a risk. A stray ember could set rushes alight. A spark could leap to a hanging cloak or thatched ceiling. With no water supply inside the home and few means to extinguish flames, a single accident could destroy everything. Entire villages had burned from one hearth gone wrong. Still, every night, peasants stoked the flames, fanned embers, and added sticks with trembling hands. They knew how quickly a cold night could kill. Fire was fickle, but it was also faithful. If tended carefully, it could hold off death for one more hour, one more night, one more season. If fire was warmth, food was fuel. But in the dead of a medieval winter, food was also a memory of better seasons, of harvests now long buried beneath snow. For peasants, eating in winter was less about nutrition and more about endurance. Meals became simpler, smaller, and more symbolic of a deep-rooted determination to outlast the cold. The winter pantry was not a pantry at all, but often a root cellar, if one was lucky enough to have it. Dug into the ground and lined with stones or wood, these dark, cool spaces held the bulk of a family's preserved food. Root vegetables like carrots, parsnips, turnips, and onions were the mainstay. Hardy and long-lasting, they could survive the cold when kept buried or stacked in straw-lined bins. Some were buried directly into mounds in the earth and marked with sticks to locate them later. Grain was a winter treasure. Barley, oats, and rye had been dried and stored during autumn, often in sacks tied high above the floor to keep them away from rats and moisture. These grains became gruel or coarse bread, dense, sour, and slow to spoil. Wheat was rare for peasants and considered a luxury reserved for the nobility. Rye and barley bread, sometimes mixed with beans or ground acorns to stretch supplies, was the daily standard. Meat was almost ceremonial. Most peasants did not eat it regularly, especially in winter. But if a pig had been slaughtered in late autumn, a common practice, it was preserved for as long as possible. Salted pork hung in rafters, hams smoked in stone outbuildings, and sausages aged in the cold. These were used sparingly. A chunk of lard melted into soup might be the only meat a family tasted all week. Fish offered an alternative. In regions near rivers or the coast, dried or salted fish could last for months. Some villages stored barrels of preserved herring or eel. On church-mandated fast days, which were numerous, meat was forbidden, and fish became the fallback protein. Eggs were a rare treat in winter, as hens laid less in the cold. Chickens were kept mostly for future laying or for trade, not frequent slaughter. Dairy, too, became scarce. Cows gave less milk in winter. Cheese, if made during the warmer months, had to last. Hard cheeses were prized for their longevity, while soft varieties were eaten quickly or lost to mold. Butter, when available, was used carefully. It spoiled faster and required cool storage, which wasn't always possible if vermin found your supplies first. Soups and stews became daily fare. A pot simmered over the hearth could stretch scraps into something warm and filling. Peasants added whatever they had: onions, cabbage, bits of grain, dried herbs, or even the last of autumn's mushrooms. A bone, saved from weeks before, might be boiled again just to coax out a final trace of fat or flavor. Portions were small. Adults often ate less so children could have more. Meals were eaten from shared bowls, with fingers or wooden spoons. Clean water was hard to find in winter, so ale, weak and homebrewed, was the standard drink. It kept better than water and provided calories, even for children. Fasting wasn't always religious, it was survival. Some nights, there simply wasn't enough. The family would go to bed hungry, clutching their bellies beneath scratchy blankets, hoping that tomorrow would bring better fortune or a generous neighbor. Hunger was constant, and yet, somehow, meals still brought people together. Even the thinnest soup, passed hand to hand, became a symbol of shared endurance. Through careful rationing, inventive storage, and sheer will, peasants stretched their food through the longest nights. They didn't feast, they endured. And when spring finally came, the first green sprout wasn't just a plant, it was a promise kept. When the sun finally disappeared behind the hills and the last ember of daylight faded, the medieval peasant's world shrank. Darkness came early in winter, sometimes before the day's work had even ended, and with it came the cold, the kind of cold that pressed into your bones. And so, nightfall wasn't a time of rest. It was a time to survive, hour by hour, breath by breath, until morning returned. Peasant families didn't have bedrooms. They had sleeping corners, nests made of straw or bracken, sometimes layered with tattered cloth, animal skins, or woven mats. The most fortunate had low wooden bed frames that kept them off the frozen ground. But most people slept directly on the dirt floor or on straw-filled sacks known as palliasses. Over time, these palliasses turned lumpy, full of fleas and mites, but they offered a barrier, however thin, between a body and the frozen earth. Winter sleep was communal. Entire families slept together for warmth. Parents pressed between children, siblings wrapped around each other like animals in a burrow. Even livestock might sleep indoors, chickens in a corner, goats tied to a post, offering shared body heat and a primitive sense of security. The scent was thick and musky, sweat, smoke, manure, and damp wool, but no one noticed. That scent was the smell of survival. There was no changing into nightwear. You slept in what you wore. Removing clothes was unthinkable. You layered more old cloaks, spare tunics, frayed wool shawls, anything to trap heat. If a fire remained in the hearth, someone would sleep closest to it, often an elder or infant, while the rest made do with each other's warmth. Blankets were rare. If a family owned one, it was patched, passed down, and worth more than a cow. Before bed, some peasants warmed stones by the fire and wrapped them in cloth to tuck at their feet. Others clutched earthenware jugs filled with warm ale or water. These makeshift heaters cooled quickly, but for those first precious minutes, they made the difference between agony and rest. But sleep was never guaranteed. Nights were long, up to 14 hours of darkness in midwinter. There were no clocks, no schedules. People drifted in and out of slumber, waking to feed the fire, tend to a crying child, or shift aching limbs. Hunger kept many awake. Cold made limbs cramp. Coughs echoed in the dark. Rats scurried. Owls called. Sleep came in fragments. Some historians believe peasants experienced segmented sleep, two distinct sleep periods broken by a quiet hour of wakefulness in the middle of the night. During this time, people prayed, whispered, tended to the fire, or simply stared into the darkness. It wasn't insomnia. It was routine, a natural rhythm shaped by the environment, and one most modern people have forgotten. Dreams, when they came, were vivid. They were shaped by cold, by want, by ancient fears and hopes. Dreams of warm bread, of green fields, of bonfires in summer festivals. And sometimes dreams of wolves, snowdrifts, and shadowy figures from folk tales told by candlelight. Morning was a slow return. If the fire had gone out, relighting it was the first priority. If snow had drifted in through the roof, someone had to brush it away. If limbs felt stiff and numb, they were rubbed vigorously to restore warmth. And if someone hadn't woken up at all, it was met with silence. Death in winter was not dramatic. It was expected. The cold chose who would stay and who would slip quietly into the frost. Yet every morning that a family rose together, bleary-eyed, shivering, hungry, was a quiet victory. Each breath was proof we made it. One more night behind us, one night closer to spring. No medieval peasant survived winter alone. Survival, like farming and faith, was communal. Each village was a web of interdependence, bound not by convenience, but by necessity. When the world outside turned white and silent, it was often the hands of neighbors, calloused, familiar, and equally desperate, that helped you make it through. A typical village held fewer than 150 people, spread across a cluster of modest homes and fields, under the watchful eye of the manor house or church. Everyone knew everyone else. You knew who was expecting a baby, who had lost a husband to the fever, whose cow had stopped giving milk. You shared walls, paths, gossip, and sometimes even food. Winter brought hardship to all, but never equally. Some households hoarded their grain. Others had more pigs to slaughter, or children old enough to chop wood. Then there were those who had fallen behind, sick, widowed, or struck by a bad harvest. In the coldest weeks, the unspoken code of mutual aid kicked in. It wasn't charity, it was survival. One family might lend firewood in exchange for a warm cloak. Another might share broth if the neighbor had straw to patch a roof. Women were especially vital to this network. They passed on food scraps, mended garments together, delivered babies in icy rooms, and kept eyes on each other's children. Gossip was more than chatter. It was intelligence, an early warning system for sickness, famine, or injury. If an elder hadn't been seen in 2 days, someone checked. If a child coughed blood, the entire street knew by sundown. Work was also communal. Men cut firewood in pairs or groups, dragging logs from distant forest edges. Before the snow became too deep, thatching a roof in midwinter might bring a crowd, each one climbing the frame or handing reeds, because next week the favor would be returned. Peasants didn't need calendars. They measured time by who needed help and who gave it last. Crisis didn't erase tensions. There were feuds, suspicions, even accusations of theft or witchcraft. But winter demanded a truce, if only temporarily. A neighbor's warmth might keep your baby alive. A borrowed cloak might prevent a fever. When the sky stayed gray for days and stores ran low, enemies became collaborators, if only for a season. The church played a subtle but vital role in binding the community. Priests reminded villagers that helping others in winter was a form of piety. Almsgiving, even in the form of a crust of bread, was believed to lessen time in purgatory. Festivals, even modest ones, brought flickers of joy. A shared pot of ale for Christmas, dried apples on St. Brigid's Day, or candle-blessed blessings at Candlemas. These moments gave peasants not just warmth, but meaning. For the poorest, the landless laborers, and traveling beggars, the village could be a sanctuary or a sealed gate. If allowed in, they found barns to sleep in, scraps from the kitchen, or a place near the fire. If turned away, they disappeared into snowdrifts, their names remembered only in ghost stories. In the end, survival was stitched together like a quilt, each villager a patch, ragged or rich, necessary to the whole. No peasant made it to spring without touching and being touched by the lives around them. Through kindness, barter, and an understanding that no one wins winter alone, the village endured. It wasn't just about food or fire. It was about each other. Children in medieval peasant families weren't coddled, but they weren't forgotten either. In a season that threatened even the strongest adults, the youngest were both the most vulnerable and the most precious. Every winter brought fear for their lives. A single fever, a night of coughing, or an empty stomach could spell disaster. Yet somehow, many survived, through fierce love, simple remedies, and desperate ingenuity. Parents fought to shield their children from the cold's cruelest blows. A peasant child didn't own toys or soft blankets, but they had arms around them, always. Infants were carried close to the chest, swaddled tightly in wool wraps, their mother's body heat offering protection far better than anything the home could provide. Even at night, babies slept pressed against a parent, wrapped in spare skirts or under the shared cloak. Toddlers were bundled in hand-me-downs, tunics that dragged the floor, woolen caps tied under the chin, mittens made from scrap cloth, if any at all. Older children helped with winter chores. They fetched water from the frozen stream, gathered kindling, or fed the animals. Their hands turned red and cracked, but the work kept them warm. It also distracted them from hunger. Parents taught children how to stay close to the fire, how to dry socks with a hot stone, and which corner of the cottage stayed warmest during storms. These weren't idle lessons. They were survival skills, passed down like heirlooms. Illness was a constant fear. There were no doctors in the village, and the closest healer might be a day's walk away if she wasn't sick herself. Colds turned to fevers fast. Whooping cough, chills, or even a rash could take a child within days. Mothers used herbal teas, mint, elderberry, or chamomile, to soothe coughs. They applied mustard poultices to the chest, or wrapped hot stones in cloth to press against aching bellies. Sometimes they simply rocked and whispered prayers while the child sweated and shivered. Children learned to endure pain early. There was no concept of too young to help or too delicate, but that didn't mean they were unloved. In fact, their survival was often the family's entire focus. When food was scarce, adults gave their portions to the children. When a cloak needed mending, the child's was fixed first. Peasants understood the future came through their children, and so they sheltered that flame, even as everything else froze. When possible, they tried to keep spirits up. Songs were sung quietly by the fire, simple rhymes, made-up games with stones or bits of carved wood, or stories of brave knights and clever foxes gave children something other than the cold to think about. Grandparents, if present, often served as storytellers, spinning tales between coughs that made little ones forget the wind howling outside. Schooling was rare, but learning was constant. Children were taught how to sew, chop, stir, and kneel in prayer. They were shown how to blow on coals to bring them back to life, how to check for frostbite, how to stretch dough when flour was low. Winter was a classroom, and every lesson could save a life. And when a child died, the grief was deep and raw. It was never expected, even when it was common. Tiny graves in frozen churchyards held more than bodies. They held hope cut short. Yet somehow, families carried on, because the other children still needed tending. The next winter still loomed. In a world ruled by hardship, childhood was brief, but not without light. Even in the bitterest months, laughter could be heard, thin, defiant, wrapped in wool and soot. In medieval winter, the cold didn't just chill bodies. It seeped into lungs, joints, and wounds, bringing with it a plague of ailments that could swiftly turn deadly. Illness was not a question of if, but when. And for peasants, already weakened by hunger and hardship, the margin between a cold and a coffin was perilously thin. The most common afflictions were those brought on or worsened by the cold: respiratory infections, chilblains, rheumatism, and fevers. Drafty homes with damp walls and smoke-filled air made fertile ground for illness. The constant exposure to cold air, poor sanitation, and lack of vitamins wore down the body's defenses. A child's cough might last all season. An elder's joint pain might become permanent lameness, and a young mother's fever might linger until she slipped quietly away one frostbitten morning. There were no hospitals in the countryside. Physicians, if they existed at all, served the nobility and lived miles away. Monasteries might offer rudimentary care, but travel was treacherous in snow and ice. Instead, peasants relied on herbal remedies, community healers, often older women with inherited knowledge and prayer. Faith and folk medicine worked side by side, and both were deeply trusted. Common remedies included teas and tinctures made from dried herbs collected in warmer months. Elderberry was used to treat colds, yarrow for fevers, and horehound for coughs. Garlic was considered both food and medicine, believed to chase away sickness and evil alike. Onion poultices were placed on chests to draw out phlegm. Warmed milk mixed with honey and herbs offered comfort and hydration if milk was available. But for many ailments, there were no cures, only management and mercy. Fevers were treated with cool cloths and whispered prayers. Wounds were packed with moss or cobwebs to staunch bleeding, and sometimes rinsed with wine or vinegar when such luxuries could be spared. Chilblains, those painful swellings on fingers and toes, were rubbed with goose fat or warmed stones. Frostbite was not always recognized for what it was. Dead skin and tissue simply blackened, cracked, and often led to infection. To combat infections or unknown illnesses, some healers resorted to rituals, burning herbs and wafting the smoke, burying objects near doorways to protect against spirits, or drawing symbols in the soot above doorframes. Religious relics were passed hand to hand. Holy water, if available, was sprinkled in sick rooms. Superstition and spirituality merged in the peasant worldview. One could not separate body from soul. Contagion was poorly understood. Still, villagers noticed patterns. When one house fell ill, others watched warily. Sometimes a sick member was isolated, banished to a shed, or left in the cold. Other times, neighbors risked exposure to deliver hot food or warm blankets. It was a cruel balance, mercy or survival. Mental health had no name, but its symptoms were visible. A father hollow-eyed and listless after burying 2 children. A mother who muttered prayers long after the candles burned out. Winter's psychological toll was heavy, particularly when illness swept through a household. Melancholy, they called it. Sometimes it passed with the thaw. Other times it stayed. Despite it all, peasants did what they could. They leaned on old wisdom, shared what they knew, and hoped their bodies would outlast the season. In the face of each cough, each fever, each pale cheek, they fought not with medicine, but with love, belief, and determination. Every breath taken under a thatched roof, every wound that healed, every child who smiled again was a quiet triumph. In a world where the line between health and death blurred with every falling snowflake, surviving the cold was more than physical. It was a kind of quiet, everyday defiance. Winter in a medieval village was not just something you endured. It was something you heard, or rather, didn't hear. As the days shortened and snow blanketed the world, sound became scarce. The buzz of bees, the hum of plows, the shouting of men in the fields, gone. In their place, silence, stillness, the occasional creak of frozen wood, the distant howl of wind between branches, and the muffled steps of a villager walking across snow. Life didn't stop, but it did quiet down. To a modern ear, this might sound peaceful, but for medieval peasants, the silence of winter was unsettling. It carried weight. It reminded them that the world had shrunk, that the birds had fled, the crops had died, and the sky rarely spoke. That silence wasn't a lack of sound. It was the presence of cold, of emptiness, of waiting. It made time stretch long, especially during the endless nights. Inside the cottage, however, there was life. The crackle of a fire, the gentle clink of a spoon in a pot, the low murmur of a lullaby sung by a mother trying to coax sleep from a hungry child. Conversations were soft and slow. People spoke less, conserving breath and emotion. Whispers carried in the confined space. Privacy was impossible, so secrets were saved for warmer months. Time passed differently. Without clocks, peasants measured days by the fire's needs, the light in the sky, or the hunger in their bellies. The rooster's crow, less dependable in winter, was replaced by the church bell, if there was one, or simply habit. A man might rise when his toes grew too cold to sleep. A woman might knead dough not by the hour, but by feel, rhythm, and repetition learned from her mother. Music, while scarce, wasn't gone. In some homes, someone might hum a tune handed down through generations. The same melody, sung by candlelight, over and over, as much to calm the singer as to entertain the listener. Instruments were rare, but flutes made from bone or whistles carved from wood might offer a brief reprieve. In larger villages, church choirs brought sacred songs to winter feasts, solemn, hopeful, echoing in stone naves, warmed only by breath and candles. Outside, winter brought strange noises, ice cracking on a frozen stream, groaning like a beast beneath its glassy skin, the moan of wind pressing against shutters, the sudden shriek of a fox hunting at night. These sounds pierced the silence and reminded peasants that nature was still alive, raw, unpredictable, and entirely indifferent to their presence. The rhythm of winter was circular: work, rest, tend the fire, eat, pray, sleep, repeat. There was little to break the pattern, and this monotony bred both comfort and unease. Some found solace in routine, others found madness. The sound of a child breathing steadily beside you, the creak of a roof that hadn't yet collapsed, the hiss of steam from a bubbling pot. Peasants didn't mark winter with grand events. They marked it with moments: a neighbor's voice in the snow, the church bell on Christmas morning, the first birdsong of spring. Each sound a milestone, a signal that they were still here, still alive. The village breathed together, even if quietly. And in that breath, in that shared silence, there was strength. In the bleak stillness of winter, when fields were barren and the sky offered no promise, the church became more than a house of God, became a hearth for the spirit. For the medieval peasant, whose days were filled with toil and whose nights were filled with cold, faith was not just a comfort, it was a necessity, a framework for survival that shaped every breath, every hardship, and every hope. The village church was often the only stone building in miles, its thick walls resisting both wind and time. Though unheated and cold as the grave, it offered something no cottage could: meaning. Inside, candles flickered in dark corners, casting long shadows against statues of saints and wooden crucifixes. The scent of wax and incense clung to its bones, mingling with the damp breath of the congregation. Attendance wasn't optional. The church calendar dictated the year as much as the sun and moon. From Advent to Candlemas, winter was dense with holy days, fasts, and feasts. These rituals offered structure in the shapeless weeks of snow. They reminded peasants that they were part of a divine cycle, that their suffering was seen, and that redemption was promised if not now, then later. Priests, often among the few literate people in the village, served as both spiritual leaders and seasonal guides. They read from sacred texts, administered sacraments, and interpreted the meaning of strange weather or sudden illness. A harsh frost might be punishment for sin. A mild thaw might be a blessing. This theological lens gave peasants both explanation and agency. Confess, pray, atonand. Maybe the sickness will pass. Maybe the calf will survive. Maybe spring will come early. Winter festivals had roots both pagan and Christian. Christmas was celebrated not with gifts or trees, but with Mass, a rare feast, and perhaps the lighting of extra candles. The feast of St. Stephen brought alms to the poor. Epiphany marked the arrival of the Magi, and on February 2nd, Candlemas blessed the year's candles, which would light many dark nights ahead. Each event was small but powerful, a spark in the gloom. Religion permeated the home too. Crosses carved into wooden beams, prayers whispered before meals, charms hung by the door to keep out evil. Children learned their first Latin words, not in school, but in church: Pater, Noster, Ave Maria. They learned to kneel before they could walk steadily, to fear hell before they knew the shape of the world. But faith was not just reverent, it was imaginative. Saints were not distant icons, but familiar figures. Saint Blaise for throat ailments, Saint Anthony for lost things, Saint Bridget for hearth and home. Peasants spoke to these saints like neighbors, asking them for warmth, for healing, for strength, and sometimes they felt heard. The church also served as refuge. If a cottage collapsed or a family lost everything in a fire, the church might shelter them, not comfortably, but symbolically. It was a place no one could be turned away, and in a season that thrived on isolation that mattered. Some found doubt in winter's hardships, others found deeper faith. When all else failed, when food ran out, when fever raged, when roofs gave in under snow, was belief that remained. Belief that suffering had purpose, that life, even a peasant's life, was sacred, that endurance itself was holy. So they prayed, in freezing pews, in frostbitten fields, in the quiet hours of segmented sleep. They prayed not always for miracles, but for survival, for just one more day, for the strength to light the next fire. And in those prayers, whispered beneath wool and breath, they found something like warmth. For medieval peasants, winter brought not only cold and hunger but duty. No season could stop the obligations owed to the local lord, whose authority was as present as the snow on the fields. The feudal system didn't hibernate. Even as smoke curled from low chimneys and frost clung to the branches, power demanded payment, and peasants, with chapped hands and weary backs, gave what they could because not giving was never an option. The structure of feudalism was deeply entrenched in peasant life. A typical villager did not own his land. Instead, he rented it either through labor or goods from the lord who held the manor. This lord could be a nobleman, a bishop, or even a monastery. His manor wasn't just a residence. It was the administrative and economic heart of the region. The peasants were its lifeblood, but they had little say in how it beat. In winter, When farming slowed, lords often increased their expectations. With crops harvested and stored, it was time to pay rents, sometimes in grain, sometimes in poultry or eggs, sometimes in coin, though few peasants had any. Every household owed its share, and stewards came knocking regardless of weather. Woe to the peasant who failed to meet his quota. Late payment could mean fines, confiscation of tools or livestock, or being barred from using common resources, unthinkable punishment in the coldest months. Labor services were also demanded. Even in snow, there were fences to mend, carts to repair, firewood to gather for the manor, and ditches to clear. Some peasants were required to work a set number of days on the lord's domain, the part of the estate farmed directly for the lord's benefit. These tasks were called boon work, and while sometimes delayed in severe weather, they were rarely cancelled. Despite the hardships, lords did offer certain protections, though not always out of kindness. It was in their interest to keep their peasants alive. After all, a dead tenant couldn't pay rent. Some lords distributed grain in lean years, allowed deferred payments, or granted firewood access from the manor's forests. Others were far less generous, squeezing their villages for every last resource. The manor court held even in winter, adjudicated local disputes. It wasn't just a place for punishment. Tit was the record keeper of village life. Who owed what? Who failed to show up for work? Who let their pigs roam freely? A peasant might dread court day more than snowfall, because one judgment could make a bad winter far worse. There were social expectations, too. The lord's household might host a Christmas feast, and certain villagers, reeves, bailiffs, favored tenants, could be invited. Though these gatherings were rare and formal, they served as reminders of hierarchy. A moment of warmth. Taxes to the church, known as tithes, also persisted in winter. 10% of one's produce was owed, even when produce was sparse. Some paid with eggs or cloth instead. Failure to tithe could lead to spiritual as well as social consequences, which no peasant risked lightly. Still, under the layers of duty, resentment often simmered. Winter made it clearer than ever who suffered and who remained comfortable. The manor house had thick walls, better cloaks, and more food. The lords weren't fetching water through the snow or burying children in frozen ground. Yet open rebellion was rare. Most peasants accepted the system as immutable. It was the world as it had always been, so they bent, endured, and found small freedoms where they could buy, hiding an extra loaf, trading quietly at the market, or slipping off to gather firewood a few paces beyond what was allowed. Winter didn't erase hierarchy. It revealed it in frost and fire, in hunger and hoarded wealth. Even in the heart of winter, when roads were half ice and wind sliced through wool like knives, trade didn't stop entirely. It merely changed shapes, smaller, quieter, more desperate. Peasants, they bartered, traded, and sometimes sold what little they had. Winter markets, however infrequent, were lifelines of both commerce and connection. Most villages held small market days throughout the year. In winter, these shrank. A summer market bustled with carts, livestock, and distant travelers. A winter one might consist of a dozen villagers standing beside baskets wrapped in linen, trying to keep apples from freezing solid. But to the peasant woman with an extra skein of wool, or the man with cured meat to spare, that small market was hope. Barter was the rule. Coin existed, but most peasants rarely saw it. Instead, a rabbit might be traded for a sack of oats. A bundle of firewood might be swapped for a spool of thread. These transactions were personal, often done among neighbors or traveling peddlers. Trust mattered. So did reputation. A villager known for watering down ale or overstating the quality of a goose-feather pillow might find himself avoided the next time market rolled around. Winter trade was often more strategic. With fewer goods available, prices formal or informal rose. Dried goods became currency. Salted fish, pickled vegetables, smoked sausages, preserved fruits, and honeycombs were especially valuable. Wool yarn, candles, and firewood were also in high demand. If a peasant had the foresight and luck to preserve extra supplies in the autumn, they might enter winter with a kind of temporary wealth. Markets weren't always formal gatherings. Sometimes, especially in more isolated villages, trade happened over fences or behind barns. A knock at the door, a whispered offer. These informal exchanges blurred the lines of legality, especially when involving game from the forest or goods owed as tithe. But in winter, survival often outranked law. Traveling traders, though fewer in winter, still passed through. Wrapped in furs, their carts piled high with wares from distant towns. They brought luxury and temptation, spices, beads, combs, carved trinkets, or foreign clothal, rare and unaffordable for most. But sometimes, a small trade could be made. A thick fur hat in exchange for an heirloom spoon. A flask of oil swapped for a handful of beeswax. The traders spoke of other villages, other lords, other winters, and, for a moment, the world felt bigger than the frost-bitten lane between the fields and the chapel. Markets also carried news. Gossip traveled faster than carts. A child cured by a wandering healer. A neighboring village struck by fever. A noble's marriage, or a band of raiders sighted miles away. These stories were traded as eagerly as goods, and often with the same embellishments. In a world without written news or reliable communication, markets were the peasant's newspaper, folded into conversation, half-true but wholly useful. Children were often present, eyes wide, learning how trade worked by watching or helping carry goods. For them, the market was excitement, a brief escape from the monotony of winter chores, a place to see things they'd never touch, to hear languages or dialects from beyond their region, and perhaps, if lucky, to taste a candied nut or dried plum, bought or bartered by a parent trying to brighten a cold week. Though small and sporadic, winter markets reminded villagers they were part of something larger, that even in the depths of frost, human connection continued. Goods moved, words passed, and life, however slow, went on. To the modern mind, winter clothes might conjure down jackets, waterproof boots, and fleece-lined mittens. But for a medieval peasant, warmth was less about technology and more about ingenuity, layering, and knowing how to make do with what little you had. There were no closets full of options, no seasonal shopping trips. Everything worn in winter was stitched by hand, often from materials prepared months earlier and maintained with care born from necessity. Wool was the backbone of peasant winter wear, thick, water-resistant, and relatively warm even when damp. Wool came from village sheep and was often spun, woven, and dyed at home. Natural colors, grays, browns, creams, dominated the landscape. Bright hues existed, but dyes were expensive and labor-intensive. A deep green or rusty red tunic might signal a slightly better-off household, but most villagers wore earth tones that blended with the muddy snow. Clothing was built in layers. The base might be a simple linen shift or chemise worn next to the skin. though thin linen wicked moisture away from the body, keeping the wearer drier and slightly warmer. Over this came woolen garments, long tunics for men, kirtles or dresses for women. Additional layers were added as needed: shawls, cloaks, aprons, hoods, and leg bindings. Clothes were rarely form-fitting. They needed to allow for movement, trap air, and serve multiple purposes throughout the year. Trousers, when worn, were often loose and tied with cords. Women might wear woolen hose, sometimes to pairs if they had them, pulled up to the thigh and held with garters. Feet were kept warm with thick wool socks, sometimes doubled, and shoes, if one had them, were made of leather, often ill-fitting and thin by today's standards. These were carefully preserved and passed down when possible. The pelts were not just for warmth, they signaled a bit of luck or careful planning. Peasants who trapped their own animals might tan and sew the hides into winter mitts or neck wraps. But for most, fur was a luxury. Heat lost through the head was well understood, even if not scientifically explained. Woolen coifs, caps, or thick hoods were worn day and night. In bed, people slept with their heads wrapped in cloth or under heavy cowls. Children, especially, were bundled tightly to prevent earaches and chill. Outer garments included the famous medieval cloak, simple in design but essential, made of several layers of wool, and sometimes fastened with a wooden toggle or a rope belt. A cloak could double as a blanket, shield against wind, or even an impromptu baby carrier. Cloaks varied in size depending on available fabric, and in families with multiple children, a single cloak might rotate among them. Repair was constant. Every garment bore signs of mending patches, reinforced stitching, mismatched thread. There was no throwing anything away. Even the smallest scraps were saved to reinforce elbows, knees, or soles of shoes. A peasant woman might spend evenings darning socks by candlelight, her fingers stiff with cold but precise from years of repetition. In deep winter, layering wasn't a choice, it was survival. Children were wrapped tightly, sometimes with wool strips crisscrossing their legs and arms. Babies were swaddled with extra cloth and tucked close to the fire, but far enough to avoid sparks. Elderly villagers, their circulation slower, wore the thickest garments available, often wrapped in old cloaks or heavy blankets during the day. There was no such thing as fashion for peasants in winter-only function. Every stitch held warmth, memory, and the quiet resilience of a people determined to outlast the frost. Winter in medieval Europe wasn't just about snow and ice, it was about illness. The cold crept not only into homes, but into bones, lungs, and blood. For peasants already worn thin by labor and hunger, the chill season brought more than discomfort, it brought risk. Sickness spread easily in the cramped, smoky homes of the poor, where windows were tiny or non-existent, and fresh air was a rare luxury. The most common afflictions were respiratory. Coughs that began in late autumn might deepen into something worse by January: bronchitis, pneumonia, or consumption, as tuberculosis was known. These illnesses didn't come with neat medical names or sterile diagnoses. They were recognized by signs: a hollow cough, flushed cheeks, labored breath, and often, by the way, they clung to the weak and didn't let go. Fevers were dreaded. A child might be healthy one day and listless the next. With no thermometers or reliable methods of diagnosis, a parent's hand on a forehead was the first and only tool of detection. Some believed fever was caused by sign, others by imbalance in the humors of the body. Blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. This belief shaped most medical treatment, which relied on restoring balance often through purging, bleeding, or applying heated poultices. Home remedies were the frontline defense. Herbs gathered in warmer months were dried and stored with care. Chamomile, elderflower, yarrow, and mint were brewed into teas. Onion poultices were laid on chests. Garlic, believed to ward off illness and spirits alike, was eaten raw or crushed into broths. Honey, treasured and rare, was used to soothe sore throats and dress wounds, and if no remedy worked, people turned to prayer. The line between medicine and magic was thin. A charm tied around the neck, a whispered blessing from a village wise woman, or an herbal sachet tucked under the mattress might be part of a healing ritual. Some peasants knew local healers, usually women, who carried knowledge passed down from mother to daughter, drawn from plants, patterns, and experience. Though mistrusted by some clergy and landowners, these women were often the only accessible source of care. Of course, the church offered healing to holy relics, sacred water, or visits to a shrine were considered ways to cure or at least ease suffering. Confession and absolution were also seen as paths to physical wellness. Disease, after all, was not just a bodily ailment, it was a spiritual crisis. A fever could be penance, recovery, a divine reward. Contagion was poorly understood, but instinct told people to be cautious. If someone in the household fell ill, they were often isolated, moved closer to the fire, or away from sleeping areas. Food was offered separately. In extreme cases, families might avoid a sick neighbor entirely, fearing whatever invisible force had struck them down. But often, the smallness of homes made true isolation impossible. Infants and the elderly suffered most. A baby's immune system was fragile, and with no vaccinations or antibiotics, a mild infection could become fatal overnight. The old, already weakened by a lifetime of labor, succumbed to cold, infection, or even simple malnourishment. Death was quiet, frequent, and rarely unexpected, and when it came in winter, it was doubly cruel. Frozen ground made burial difficult, and grief was layered atop survival. Yet, even in illness, life moved on. Mothers nursed the sick with tired hands. Fathers mixed herbs by candlelight. Siblings shared warmth, bedclothes, and whispered prayers. In those moments, survival wasn't just physical, it was communal. A village, small as it was, held each other up through each wave of sickness, not always successfully, but always together. In the medieval countryside, childhood was less an age and more a phase. Brief, fragile, and often filled with responsibility. Winter didn't pause for the young. Children were expected to contribute early, and though their tasks varied by age and ability, every small effort mattered when the nights were long and the cold refused to loosen its grip. For children as young as 5 or 6, winter days were filled with chores. Boys might help carry firewood from the woods, feed livestock, or sweep the snow from paths between the cottage and the latrine. Girls joined their mothers in spinning wool, tending the hearth, or watching over younger siblings. Tasks weren't optional. They were learned by observing, repeated daily, and expected to be done with quiet focus. There was no school in the modern sense. Education, if it existed at all, was local and limited. A lucky village might have a priest willing to teach a few boys how to read and recite Latin, but most children learned through experience, how to bind a bundle of kindling, how to patch a tear in wool, how to spot the signs of a sick animal. Survival was the curriculum, and winter sharpened every lesson. But even in hardship, there was room for play. When chores were finished and the snow was firm, children found ways to entertain themselves. They rolled snowballs, slid across icy patches, or chased chickens through slush. Twigs became swords, and frozen puddles became stages for imagined battles. Laughter echoed between timber walls, breaking the monotony of long, gray days. Toys were rare and almost always handmade. A carved wooden animal, a rag doll sewn from scraps, or a ball stuffed with rags could be a prized possession. Often, older siblings passed toys down to younger ones, if the toys survived that long. Playthings doubled as teaching tools. A girl's doll taught her to care for a child. A boy's toy bow hinted at future duties, defending livestock from wolves or hunting birds for stew. Bedtime in winter came early. The darkness set in by mid-afternoon, and children, like adults, shared beds for warmth. A single straw mattress might hold 3 or 4 siblings, huddled together under layered woolen blankets, or even cloaks repurposed as covers. Stories, rhymes, and whispered songs helped lull them to sleep, often told by older sisters or grandmothers with hoarse voices and warm hands. Illness loomed heavily over childhood. Many wouldn't survive their early years. Fevers, coughs, and stomach ailments claimed lives quickly, especially in winter when nutrition dipped and exposure rose. Parents mourned but carried on. Death was part of village life. Small graves in churchyards marked losses that echoed silently through generations. Still, bonds between parents and children were strong. A father might teach his son how to carve a spoon. A mother might wrap her daughter's fingers around a spindle and whisper encouragement. These quiet acts of instruction were also acts of love, ways of passing on not just skills, but the will to endure. In winter, that will was everything. Even spiritual life touched children early. They attended Mass with their families, learned to cross themselves, and memorized prayers long before understanding their meaning. On special feast days, they might receive small treats, an apple, a piece of bread dipped in honey, or a ribbon to wear. These moments became cherished memories, anchored in the coldest months of the year. Children weren't just passive observers of winter. They were participants. They worked, played, got sick, got better, learned, and slowly grew into the same roles their parents held. The cycle of seasons was also the cycle of life, and winter was a proving ground. In every scraped knee, every cold breath, and every chore done in silence, the next generation was forged. In the thick of winter, when frost laced the windows and the dark stretched for nearly half the day, warmth wasn't always found in fire or furs. It was found in words, in rhythm, in song. For medieval peasants, evenings weren't only for sleep and stillness. They were for stories, for music, for the slow dance of shared imagination that helped chase away the cold. A typical peasant home had little space and even less luxury, but one thing it often had was a voice, sometimes many. As darkness fell and embers glowed faintly in the hearth, families gathered close. This was the time for tales. The oldest in the house, often a grandmother or a visiting uncle, might begin with a tale from their youth. Stories of harsh winters survived, lost love found again, or wolves driven off with nothing but courage and a torch. Many of these tales were oral traditions, passed from generation to generation, without ink or parchment. Myths of forest spirits, wandering monks with magical books, or local saints performing quiet miracles, were spoken with conviction. Though grounded in the everyday, these stories gave peasants access to something bigger, a sense of meaning, a thread of wonder woven into the cloth of their daily lives. Children huddled close during ghost stories, eyes wide, ears sharp, tales of revenants, the walking dead, or fairies luring lost travelers into the snowbound woods sparked a delicious terror. But not all stories were grim. Many were humorous or hopeful, featuring clever farmers outwitting greedy lords or mischievous animals triumphing over danger. Alongside storytelling, music flourished in its own humble way. Most peasants had no instruments beyond the simplest wooden flutes, crude drums, or jaw harps made of iron. But the real instrument was the voice. Songs were sung to mark the seasons, to soothe crying children, or to lift spirits during chores. Winter songs were slower, often reflective, but some, especially during the 12 days of Christmas, were joyous and loud. Communal singing helped unify villages. A group of youths might gather to wassail, walking from cottage to cottage, singing songs and receiving bread, ale, or fruit in exchange. This tradition, an ancestor of caroling, was a rare chance to celebrate in the middle of the harshest season. It offered laughter, companionship, and the rare treat of shared food. Poetry and riddles also played a part. Riddle games were especially popular with children and young adults, used to pass time and subtly teach lessons about the world. A clever riddle could reveal knowledge of nature, farming, or even village gossip. They were small but powerful tools of education and entertainment rolled into one. Dances were rare in the depths of winter due to limited space and cold floors, but when weather allowed, indoor foot-tapping, clapping rhythms, and spinning games brightened long evenings. These gatherings might occur at a neighbor's house or after a feast, with bodies packed tightly to conserve heat and lift spirits. Not all music or stories were secular. Religious hymns, Latin chants, and tales of saints and biblical heroes were told with reverence. These stories reminded listeners that hardship was a path toward salvation, that even the poorest soul might one day sit in glory if they endured with faith. In a time without books, without radios, without distractions beyond survival, the imagination was sacred. It warmed more than fingers and toes. It nourished minds starved for beauty and connected hearts isolated by cold. In every story told, every note sung, medieval peasants claimed a moment of escape, not from their world, but into the deeper meaning within it. In the heart of a medieval winter, faith was not a luxury, it was a necessity. The biting cold, the frequent deaths, the failing crops, and the dark days that seemed to never end were enough to test even the strongest spirits. For the peasant, the church wasn't just a place of worship, it was a source of structure, of hope, and of answers to the unanswerable. In winter, that need intensified. Each village, no matter how small, had access to some form of spiritual guidance, a priest, a chapel, or a traveling monk. Churches were simple structures, often unheated and made of stone or timber. Yet they offered something no hearth or cloak could, the warmth of belief. Even on the coldest mornings, villagers wrapped in cloaks and shawls would shuffle into church for Mass, their breath fogging in the frigid air, their fingers clasped tightly in prayer. The church dictated much of the peasant's calendar, and winter was dense with holy days. Advent marked the beginning of spiritual preparation for Christmas. The season reminded people of both the birth of Christ and the promise of renewal, even as snow buried their fields. After Christmas came Epiphany, and later Candlemas in early February, when candles were blessed to carry light into the darkness of winter. These rituals weren't just religious, they were emotional anchors. The lighting of candles, the scent of incense, the chanting of Latin hymns provided sensory escape from the harshness outside. Even peasants who didn't fully understand the words took comfort in the rhythms, the mystery, and the sense of divine order. Confession was more frequent in winter. When illness threatened or a neighbor passed away, peasants looked inward. Had they sinned? Was this suffering punishment or a test? The priest offered not only absolution but reassurance. His words, though sometimes stern, were a lifeline. The soul, he reminded them, could remain warm even as the body ached with cold. Processions occasionally took place through snow-covered roads, especially during famines, plagues, or strange weather. Villagers would follow a priest holding a cross or relic, praying for mercy, for food, for warmth. These events were deeply communal, shared expressions of desperation and hope. Charity, as promoted by the Church, also surfaced more visibly during winter. Better-off villagers might donate extra food or fuel to those in need. The local priest often knew who was struggling most and became a quiet intermediary, directing resources where they were needed. But faith wasn't without fear. Winter brought superstitions to the surface, whispers about demons in the forest, witches stealing warmth from hearths, or souls of the unbaptized wandering in the snow-haunted village evenings. The Church taught of heaven and hell, and villagers believed their actions, however humble, tilted the scale. A prayer muttered in the cold could mean the difference between protection and peril. Even funerals carried special weight in winter. Frozen ground made burial difficult, and sometimes bodies were kept in outbuildings until a thaw came. These delays compounded grief. Families feared souls lingering, unburied, and unrested. Special prayers were said to guide them, and candles burned through the night as both tribute and defense against the dark. In all of this, the ritual, the rhythm, the fear and hope, the Church was more than a religion. It was a constant presence in the peasants' winter, a source of meaning, community, and endurance. For those with so little control over their world, faith offered a structure that could not freeze. In the medieval countryside, love was rarely the stuff of ballads and poetry. It was grounded in survival, duty, and the seasons, and winter, cold and unforgiving, often played a surprising role in how relationships formed, flourished, or fractured. For peasants, courtship and marriage were less about romance and more about alliance, warmth, and the weaving of two lives into one thread of endurance. Winter months, with their slower pace of labor, allowed more social interaction. The fields were resting. Livestock were kept closer to home. Days were shorter, but evenings longer. These moments, though rare, provided fertile ground for matchmaking. Young men might visit neighboring farms more frequently during the season, offering to help chop firewood or check on sick livestock, not entirely out of charity. These visits allowed for conversation, a glimpse into family life, and time near the girl they admired. Young women, meanwhile, worked alongside their mothers, often under watchful eyes, but with occasional freedoms to speak privately by the well. Love was, for most, a luxury. Marriages were arranged or strongly encouraged by families, with practical considerations at the forefront. A strong son-in-law could mean better harvests next year. a modest but steady daughter-in-law, brought not only hands for labor, but a potential dowry of linens, tools, or livestock. In winter, when scarcity was felt most sharply, these calculations mattered even more. Yet, affection wasn't absent. Many couples, though bound initially by arrangement, grew to rely on and even cherish one another. Winter provided time for these bonds to deepen. When fields no longer called at dawn and darkness closed in early, couples spoke more, worked side by side indoors, and shared stories from their respective families. These small intimacies formed the foundation of trust. Weddings themselves were less common in deep winter, but not impossible. Church calendars, weather conditions, and food supplies all influenced timing. However, betrothals, promises of marriage, often occurred during the colder months. These public declarations were celebrated with modest feasts, songs, and sometimes dancing. The occasion was about more than two individuals. It united families, reassured the village of future stability, and marked a rare cause for joy amid winter's austerity. Affectionate gestures were simple but meaningful. A carved wooden token, a woolen shawl woven over months, or a piece of bread saved from a feast were signs of care. In the absence of coins or finery, effort and time were the currencies of love. Married couples often faced their hardest tests in winter: cramped homes, sick children, dwindling food, and unrelenting cold-strained tempers and patience. Yet these hardships also created partnership: who fetched water when the well froze, who rubbed aching feet beside the fire, who sang softly when an infant cried through the night. These were acts of love as true as any poem. Children born of winter unions were celebrated as signs of renewal. Villagers believed children conceived during the long nights of winter were hardy, spirited, and blessed, cradling their child as the priest poured icy water and whispered prayers. Winter in medieval times wasn't just a test of body and spirit, it was a forge. And in that forge, love, quiet, steadfast, and essential, took shape in wool-lined homes and flickering firelight, binding people together when the world outside offered only cold. While peasants faced biting winds and failing light, their hardships did not exempt them from duty. The land they farmed, the cottages they lived in, and even the woods they gathered firewood from were owned by someone else, a lord, a baron, or a monastic order. And winter, despite its harshness, brought no reprieve from obligation. If anything, it made those demands heavier. Medieval life revolved around the manorial system. The manor was not just a house, it was an estate, an administrative center, and the power base from which the lord ruled over dozens, sometimes hundreds, of peasant tenants. In winter, the manor remained a beacon of authority. Whether blanketed in snow or choked with frozen mud, peasants were expected to answer its call. Though agricultural work slowed in winter, it didn't stop. Lords still required a portion of grain harvested during autumn, and some demanded poultry, eggs, or cured meat as part of winter dues. These taxes could be exacted in kind or labor. A family might owe firewood gathered from the lord's forest, a week of service repairing fences, or transportation of goods to a nearby town using their oxen. Even peasants who owned small plots of land owed rent in some form. Failure to deliver could lead to fines or, in extreme cases, the loss of land rights. Lords kept records, or their stewards did, and those records weren't softened by winter hardship. A death in the family or a failed harvest might earn sympathy. but more often it resulted in additional obligations placed on surviving kin. Some peasants served as reeves, essentially foremen for the manor, responsible for organizing labor and ensuring fellow villagers met their duties. It was a burdensome role, especially in winter. A reeve had to report to the manor, track who had fulfilled their obligations, and sometimes carry out punishment or enforcement. He was a peasant too, but viewed with both respect and suspicion by his neighbors. During winter, the manors, granaries, and cellars were often full, at least fuller than the peasants. Some lords practiced limited charity, offering grain to the poorest or sickest tenants. Others did not. Access to the lord's resources often depended on loyalty, past service, or the good graces of his steward. A widow might receive a small bundle of firewood. An orphan might be taken in to work in the kitchen or stable. But many simply endured alone. Legal matters also continued through winter. Manor courts were held, disputes heard, fines levied. A man might be summoned to answer for letting his pigs wander, or for failing to repair a boundary wall. These local courts were vital to village life, part justice system, part control mechanism, and a clear reminder that power rested above, not within, the village. For peasants, the manor was both a lifeline and a leash. It offered land to work and some semblance of order. But it also demanded obedience, payment, and labor. Winter highlighted this imbalance. While the peasant's cottage grew cold and his stew thinner, the manor retained warmth, food, and authority. Some lords stayed through winter. Others left for more comfortable estates or urban homes. But their presence was always felt in the demands posted by stewards, in the grain collected from village barns, and in the knowledge that survival depended not just on nature, but on favor. The cold might kill, but so could poverty, fines, or exile. In this rigid system, peasants learned to navigate power carefully. Winter was not just a physical trial, but a social one. Knowing when to speak, when to serve, and when to petition the Lord could mean the difference between barely surviving and not surviving at all. Even in snow, power cast a long shadow. Despite the frost-bitten mornings and snow-dusted roads, winter did not halt the rhythms of exchange. Trade still pulsed through the medieval world, though slower and more cautious than in warmer months. For peasants, winter markets were more than commercial hubs. They were lifelines that offered rare access to goods, information, and the outside world. Each region had its designated market towns, small, walled settlements or roadside villages granted a market charter by the king or a local lord. These towns held weekly or monthly markets, and though travel in winter was risky, the draw of essential goods made the journey worthwhile. Peasants would bundle themselves in cloaks, wrap their feet in layers of wool, and load carts with surplus grain, root vegetables, hand-woven cloth, or carved goods in hopes of trading or selling. The roads in winter were often treacherous. Mud turned to ice, and snowdrifts blocked familiar paths. Most peasants traveled on foot, but a few had donkeys or ox-drawn carts. Travel was slow, cold, and potentially dangerous, not just from the weather, but from bandits, outlaws. Desperate and emboldened by the long nights, knew that market-bound peasants might carry food, tools, or coins worth stealing. Despite the risk, markets thrived in bursts. Temporary stalls lined muddy streets or central squares. Sellers hawked salted fish, dried fruit, fire-hardened tools, pottery, candles made from tallow, and bundles of herbs said to ward off illness. Not all goods were necessities. Some were novelties: brightly dyed wool, imported spices in thimble-sized packets, or tin amulets shaped like saints. Such items were indulgences, often purchased only once a year, if at all. For many peasants, selling goods at a winter market was a gamble. Competition was stiff, and coin was scarce. Still, a well-made cloak or a sack of turnips might fetch enough to buy salt, lamp oil, or a precious iron needle. Even bartering was common, trading a chicken for boots, or a day of labor for a small bag of oats. Beyond goods, markets served as centers of news. A returning soldier might tell stories of distant wars. A merchant might share rumors of a new plague in the port cities. Travelers spoke of crop failures, law changes, or political shifts far beyond the peasant's usual reach. These fragments of knowledge gave peasants a broader sense of the world and, occasionally, early warnings about danger. Some winter markets coincided with religious festivals. Candlemas, St. Bridget's Day, and the Feast of the Epiphany were often marked with both spiritual observance and commercial opportunity. Churchyards bustled with pilgrims and buyers, while altars glowed with candles. Traveling minstrels or jugglers sometimes performed quickly before frost stilled their fingers, offering a few moments of levity between transactions. Coins, when exchanged, were precious. Many peasants went months without seeing one, relying instead on barter or feudal obligations. But at market, silver pennies changed hands. Weights and measures were loosely enforced, and disputes over scales or quality were frequent. The local bailiff might mediate, or a market official could levy a small fine. Still, most trades were conducted with trust, or at least with resigned pragmatism. The return trip home from market was solemn. Goods traded or sold, meager profits tucked away. Peasants braved the worsening cold with whatever supplies they'd gathered. A successful day meant warmer nights ahead. A poor day could mean scraping by until spring. But every journey to market, no matter how small, was an act of resilience. It proved that even in the harshest season, the will to connect, trade, and survive endured. If winter was harsh to the healthy, it was merciless to the sick. In the medieval countryside, illness was a constant threat, but in winter it became a full-fledged siege. Cold, damp air, poor sanitation, crowded homes, and weakened immune systems created the perfect storm for disease. Peasants knew this, not through science, but through hard experience. Every winter brought coughs that lingered, fevers that took children, and wounds that wouldn't heal. Without knowledge of germs or viruses, medieval people attributed illness to bad air, divine punishment, or imbalances of the body's humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Winter was thought to cause excess phlegm, leading to coughs, colds, and sluggishness. Remedies aimed to restore balance, and while often ineffective, they were based on centuries of folk wisdom and observation. The local healer, usually a wise woman, herbalist, or, in rare cases, a traveling physician, played a crucial role. She mixed potions from dried summer herbs: thyme for cough, sage for digestion, elderberry for fevers. Roots harvested before the frost were boiled into teas. Poultices made from lard and onion were applied to infected wounds, and hot stones were wrapped in cloth to warm aching joints. Sometimes, just the comfort of a warm herbal broth offered more relief than the medicine itself. More severe cases were brought to the priest. He could offer prayers, blessings, or the sacrament of extreme unction for the dying. Healing relics were occasionally brought out, bones of saints or pieces of sacred cloth believed to carry divine healing properties. Hope was often as valuable as herbs, and faith itself became a form of medicine. For children and the elderly, survival was a gamble. Respiratory illnesses spread quickly in cramped, smoky homes. Babies were swaddled tightly, placed near the fire, and nursed constantly in hopes of preserving their warmth. But once a fever set in, options were limited. There were no antibiotics, no understanding of infection, and little recourse beyond waiting and praying. Injuries, too, were far more dangerous in winter. Slips on ice could result in broken bones, which often went untreated or were poorly set. Cuts from axes or farm tools risked infection, especially when cleanliness was impossible to maintain. Without soap, alcohol, or sterile cloth, even a small wound could become deadly. Preventative care was rudimentary. Some villagers believed in protective charms, runes carved into wooden talismans, herbs hung from rafters, or amulets worn around the neck. Others followed seasonal rituals, fasting before a holy day, burning incense, or walking the boundaries of the property while reciting prayers to keep evil at bay. These acts blended superstition with spiritual belief, offering a feeling of control in a world where control was rare. The spread of disease often coincided with malnutrition. A body already weakened by lack of food couldn't fight infection. That's why villages watched one another closely. If a household went too quiet, neighbors would check in, not out of pure kindness, though that existed, but from a communal need to ensure everyone made it through. One death could ripple through the village, affecting work, morale, and family structures for seasons to come. Death was not hidden in medieval winter. It was visible and accepted. When someone passed, the body was washed and wrapped in linen, often by women of the village. Candles were lit, psalms were sung. If burial wasn't possible due to frozen ground, the body was stored in a shed or outbuilding until spring allowed for a proper grave. Yet, through all this, peasants endured. They shared knowledge, cared for one another, and kept alive the fragile thread of life. Winter illness was a cruel test, but it revealed the depth of their resilience and the quiet heroism of surviving day after day in a world that gave no guarantees. When the wind howled outside and the snow piled high against the doors, warmth was not just found in fire and blankets, but in stories, songs, and shared memory. In a world without books, in every home or entertainment on demand, peasants turned to one another for diversion and comfort. Winter, with its long, dark evenings, became the season of voices, of tales passed down, of music made by hand, and of folklore whispered across generations. Storytelling was central to village life. It was not merely a form of entertainment, but a way to teach, to warn, and to preserve culture. Grandparents recalled the hard winters of their youth, tales of legendary heroes, of saints who walked among men, or of beasts lurking in the woods. These stories weren't always meant to be believed, but they were always meant to be remembered. By candlelight, or beside a fading hearth, families huddled together while the oldest member of the household told tales of brave knights, cursed villages, mischievous fae, or lost loves. Some stories were humorous, filled with clever peasants outwitting the rich. Others were haunting, cautioning listeners against wandering too far from home or disrespecting sacred traditions. Each story carried a moral, and each teller added their own flair, reshaping the tale slightly to fit the moment. Music, too, played a vital role in lifting spirits. Without instruments, peasants relied on what they had: flutes carved from reeds, simple drums, or makeshift lutes strung with gut. More often, though, it was the human voice that filled the space. Songs were passed down orally, learned by ear, and sung in rounds or calandresponse styles that welcomed even the shyest to join in. Winter songs were often rhythmic, steady, and soothing, designed to pass the time during spinning, weaving, or other indoor tasks. Some were spiritual, others secular. A hymn one night, a harvest song the next, and perhaps a silly rhyme to make children laugh when the night felt too long. Villagers created their own verses, adapting lyrics to reference local events, inside jokes, or shared hardships. Folklore surrounding winter itself was rich and varied. In many regions, people believed that supernatural forces were stronger during the cold months. The veil between worlds was thinner, they said, allowing spirits, both kind and malevolent, to walk among the living. Shadows in the snow became omens, animal tracks were read like runes, and dreams carried deeper meaning. One common belief held that the wild hunt, a spectral procession of ghostly riders, swept across the sky on stormy nights. To hear them was bad luck, to see them a sure sign of death. Parents used such stories to keep children indoors after dark. But even adults muttered protective prayers before opening the door on wind-swept nights. Household charms were also rooted in folklore. Burying a dried sprig of rosemary near the hearth was believed to keep away sickness. Knocking 3 times on a doorframe before sharing bad news was thought to ward off its power. These rituals gave shape to fear, turning it into action, and in doing so, gave peasants a sense of control amid uncertainty. As winter dragged on, these traditions became vital. They were the glue of the community, binding people not just through shared suffering, but through shared imagination. Through them, peasants claimed ownership over their experiences, not by changing the world outside, but by transforming how they understood it. In a time when nights stretched endlessly and hope could wane, a story or a song could mean the difference between despair and endurance. These small acts of cultural inheritance, told in flickering light, with snow tapping softly on the roof, were a quiet rebellion against the cold, and they reminded each soul in that cottage that they were not alone. For medieval peasants, faith was more than a belief system. It was the backbone of daily life, a source of meaning, and a form of structure in a world often governed by hardship and uncertainty. In winter, when the nights grew long, the crops slept beneath the frost, and death felt closer with every chill, religion took on an even greater role. The church, both the building and the institution, became a sanctuary for the soul and the body alike. At the heart of every village stood a church, often the only stone building for miles. Though small and sparsely decorated by today's standards, it loomed large in peasant life. Its bell dictated the rhythm of the day, its feasts marked the seasons, and its rituals provided a sense of continuity when all else seemed precarious. Winter, with its shortened days and slowed labors, allowed for greater religious observance and deeper contemplation. Peasants attended Mass regularly, especially on holy days and Sundays, wrapped in coarse wool and kneeling on cold stone floors. Latin hymns echoed through the frigid nave, candles flickered in iron sconces, and incense offered a rare sweet scent that lingered in the chill. Few understood the priest's words, but they understood the rhythm, the reverence, and the solace it brought. Here they were reminded that suffering had purpose, that Christ, too, had known hunger and cold. Winter was dense with religious observances. Advent marked the lead-up to Christmas, a time not of feasting, but fasting and reflection. The Nativity itself brought celebration, sometimes with modest gifts, small feasts, and reenactments of the Holy Birth, using wooden figures or live animals. Epiphany followed, then Candlemas, in early February, when candles were blessed to bring light into homes and protection through the remaining winter months. These observances weren't just symbolic, they carried real psychological weight. Lighting blessed candles during a storm, praying to Saint Blaise for protection from throat ailments, or marking doors with chalk on Epiphany were all acts that gave peasants a sense of participation in divine order. Each rite helped them feel less alone in the cold. The church also played a practical role. Monasteries and large parish churches often distributed alms, bread, warm garments, or firewood to the poorest. The priest might intercede with the local lord for a desperate family, or offer healing prayers over a sick child. In times of plague or famine, the churchyard might be the first place people gathered to pray for mercy, kneeling in snow, hoping their voices would reach heaven. Confession and penance were also, despite its power, the church was not beyond critique. Some priests were kind shepherds of their flock, while others were aloof or corrupt. Still, peasants largely depended on them for weddings, funerals, baptisms, and blessings, and thus the church was tolerated, revered, and feared in equal measure. Winter stripped life to its essentials, and in those bare, frozen months, the peasant's relationship with God, personal, communal, and ritualistic, was a flame that flickered just as persistently as the hearth, fragile, perhaps, but alive, and for many that was enough. While winter was undeniably hard, it was not without joy. In the harshest season, peasants carved out moments of celebration, times to gather, feast, laugh, and momentarily forget the cold. These winter festivals were deeply tied to the agricultural and religious calendar, and they represented a vital emotional release from the daily grind of survival. Through them, even the poorest villagers found reason to smile. One of the most anticipated events was Christmas, or Christmastide, beginning on December 25th and extending through the 12 days until Epiphany. Though the peasant version of Christmas was more subdued than the noble courts, it was still marked by community gatherings, shared meals, and spiritual reflection. The fasts of Advent gave way to celebration, and if a family had managed to preserve some pork, ale, or dried fruits, now was the time to enjoy them. In many villages, the lord of the manor might host a Christmas feast for his tenants. While not guaranteed, such feasts were occasions where peasants could briefly taste the bounty of the estate. Roasted meats, bread with real butter, mulled wine, or spiced ale, even a small piece of meat or a cup of warm drink felt extravagant compared to the usual gruel and turnips. And in return, tenants offered toasts, carols, or performed short plays, folk dramas based loosely on the nativity or local legends. Yule logs were sometimes burned in hearths, large pieces of wood meant to last several days. They weren't just firewood. They were symbols of light returning in the darkest part of the year. In some regions, it was customary to save a piece of the Yule log's ash to protect the house from lightning or illness in the coming year. These little acts gave symbolic meaning to otherwise mundane rituals. New Year's Day and Epiphany brought more subdued observances. though children might receive small tokens, pieces of fruit, nuts, or wooden toys if they were lucky. Mumming and wassailing were common in certain areas. Costumed villagers parading from house to house, singing songs in exchange for food or drink. The songs, often passed down for generations, were a blend of blessing, flattery, and subtle demand. Give us something, or risk bad luck for the season ahead. Even in smaller, poorer villages, the winter months weren't devoid of games. Inside cottages, dice games were played with carved bones, and riddles were exchanged to pass time. Some villages hosted simple contests, tug-of-war, snowball fights, or log-carrying races, especially around Candlemas in early February, when the returning light promised spring's approach. These moments, while physically demanding, were wrapped in laughter and competition. The children chased one another through the snow, the elderly clapped from doorsteps, and for a few hours, hardship seemed to loosen its grip. Music filled the air during these times. Fiddles, flutes, and hand drums accompanied singing, and feet stomped on dirt floors in makeshift dances. Clapping and call-and response songs gave even the most tired hands something joyful to do. No one expected perfection. Enthusiasm mattered more than skill, but merriment had its boundaries. The church frowned on excess, especially drunkenness or licentiousness, and local lords expected decorum. A festival could turn into punishment if lines were crossed. Still, most celebrations stayed within accepted limits, balancing joy with humility, pleasure with piety. In truth, these festivals were not a luxury, but a necessity. They reaffirmed the bonds of community, reminded everyone of the cyclical nature of time, and offered a glimpse, however fleeting, of abundance and laughter. In a season defined by scarcity, that made all the difference. In medieval peasant life, winter reshaped, not erased, the roles of men, women, and children within the household. Though duties were often sharply divided by gender, the colder months demanded flexibility, cooperation, and shared sacrifice. When the fields froze and the daylight dwindled, survival depended not on one person's work, but on the delicate balance of everyone pulling their weight indoors and out. For peasant men, winter was a strange mixture of idleness and maintenance. With plowing, sowing, and harvesting on pause, their usual rhythm was disrupted. But this didn't mean rest. Men spent time mending tools, repairing fences, sharpening blades, and building or reinforcing structures that might collapse under the weight of snow or rot. A leaking roof, if left alone, could spell disaster. When weather allowed, men foraged for firewood, hunted small game, or set traps in the forest, often under threat of punishment if caught trespassing on lordly lands. These excursions were risky, physically and legally, but hunger sometimes outweighed fear. Ice fishing was another winter pursuit in some regions, using primitive techniques like chiseling holes into frozen ponds and luring fish with breadcrumbs or insects. Meanwhile, peasant women bore the brunt of winter's domestic load. Their work intensified as the family remained indoors more often, needing more frequent meals, warmer clothing, and constant care. Women rose before dawn to stoke fires, boil water, and prepare porridge or bread if flour was available. Baking took place less frequently in winter due to limited fuel, so women often relied on boiled grains and preserved root vegetables. Spinning wool was a near constant activity, done while seated by the hearth or standing by a window's pale light. Wool gathered during autumn shearings was now transformed into thread, then cloth. This was not idle work. Clothing, blankets, and even sacks for storage depended on this labor. The phrase distaff side, referring to the maternal lineage, comes from the distaff tool women used while spinning. Sewing, patching, and weaving were vital. One warm cloak could mean the difference between health and frostbite. Women mended torn tunics, added new soles to shoes, using scraps of leather or wood, and created padded hand coverings from old garments. Babies were bundled in layers of linen and wool, often tied to cradle boards or wrapped tightly for warmth. Child rearing in winter was especially demanding. Cold homes meant children were more prone to illness, and with minimal light and limited play, restlessness was common. Mothers told stories, taught hymns, or gave them tasks like picking stones from lentils, sweeping, or helping prepare meals. Older children were expected to assist with chores appropriate to their age and gender. Evenings were often the only time families gathered without labor. By candle or firelight, men might carve wood, women might spin or mend, and children listened, learned, or dozed. These were quiet hours, filled with crackling firewood, the low hum of a song, or the murmur of prayer. Despite the rigidity of gender roles, winter created a space where duties could blend. Men might help with weaving straw mats, women might tend livestock. In a season where survival was fragile, cooperation took precedence over custom. In fact, a family's resilience often depended on its ability to adapt. Peasant life was rooted in function, not fantasy. Romance was rare, and gender equality, as we understand it today, was non-existent. But within the constraints of their time, medieval peasants, men, women, and children, found ways to support one another. They passed the darkest months not as isolated individuals, but as tightly woven units of labor, love, and mutual endurance. Long before the rise of printed books and secular science, the minds of medieval peasants roamed in landscapes shaped by myth, scripture, and dream. Winter, when the natural world fell silent under snow and time itself seemed to slow, was a season not just of hardship, but of deep contemplation. In the long, dark nights, the peasant imagination took flight. It was during these quiet hours, huddled by the hearth, that dreams and visions gained meaning, and the line between reality and mystery blurred. For the medieval peasant, dreams were not dismissed as random mental activity. They were messages, sometimes divine, sometimes ominous, often symbolic. A dream of fire might mean illness, one of a river might mean a coming change, and a dream of flying could signify death or transcendence. People shared their dreams with each other like omens, interpreting signs based on a mixture of scripture, local lore, and personal intuition. The Book of Dreams, a loose collection of interpretations that varied regionally, offered insight for those literate or connected to a priest or monk. But most dream interpretation came from oral tradition. An older villager might insist that dreaming of a black dog foretold betrayal, while another claimed it was merely a warning to prepare extra firewood. Everyone had an opinion. Everyone, at some point, dreamed. Nightmares, in particular, were feared. Known as night terrors, or being hag-ridden, many believed these episodes were caused by demons, witches, or restless spirits. A person who woke gasping or sweating might be said to have been visited by a nocturnal entity. To prevent such visits, peasants used protective charms, placing iron near the bed, sprinkling holy water on the door, or sleeping with a blessed candle stub under the pillow. Beyond dreams, the imagination flourished through storytelling and visions. During the bleakest weeks of January and February, when the work was slow and the nights were relentless, the mind filled in the quiet with stories passed down by grandparents or crafted anew. Some were local ghost tales of wandering souls in the woods or haunted wells. Others were loftier, tales of heaven and hell, of saints braving frozen wildernesses, or of hidden treasures buried beneath the snow, waiting for spring's thaw to reveal them. Visions weren't confined to sleep. Some peasants claimed to see lights dancing in the woods, hear voices in the wind, or feel a presence beside them during prayer. These were not considered madness, but mystery. The spiritual and the everyday were interwoven, especially in winter, when the church taught that nature lay in symbolic death, awaiting the resurrection of spring. Even the bare trees were seen as meditations on mortality. Folk belief also held that winter was a liminal space, a time between times, when magic was more potent and strange things might occur. People told tales of shapeshifters walking freely under moonlight, of animals speaking on Christmas Eve, or of bells ringing in empty churches. These weren't just superstitions, they were coping mechanisms, turning the harsh and unknowable world into something a little more comprehensible, something with rules, even if mystical ones. The imagination, for all its strangeness, served a vital role. It gave color to gray days. It gave meaning to suffering. It helped peasants, many of whom never traveled more than a few miles from home, envision other worlds, other possibilities, and a reality beyond the one shaped by cold, hunger, and toil. Winter was the canvas, and imagination the paint. In the silence, the medieval mind was anything but still. It dreamed, it feared, it created, and in doing so, it transformed the most desolate months into something closer to wonder. Though winter often felt endless to the medieval peasant, there always came a moment, sometimes subtle, sometimes celebrated, when the promise of spring stirred again. A slightly longer day, a change in the scent of the earth, or the drip of melting snow from the thatch might mark the turning point. And when it came, hope returned, quiet but certain. In late winter, peasants began preparing for the coming agricultural year, even while frost still clung to the ground. Planning didn't require parchment or ink, just memory and communal wisdom. They remembered which crops fared best in the previous year, how much seed remained, and where the soil had rested. These decisions shaped not only the village's survival, but its spirit. Men inspected tools, plowshares, sickles, mattocks, sharpening them with care. If anything was broken beyond repair, neighbors sometimes shared or traded tools. The village economy, though modest, was often based on barter, a sack of barley for help mending a harness, or a few hours of labor in exchange for a functional hoe. Seed selection was critical. Families who'd carefully preserved grain from the previous harvest now inspected it. The smallest portion might be used to make a special porridge for Candlemas, but most was kept strictly for sowing. Children were warned not to touch the seed stores, not out of cruelty, but necessity. Every seed eaten now was one fewer to plant. The soil, too, had to be prepared. As soon as the thaw allowed, men and boys would turn over the earth with oxen or by hand. Fields that had lain fallow were chosen for planting to prevent exhaustion of nutrients. In some areas, manure collected during winter was scattered across the land, a laborious but essential act to nourish the coming crops. Women played a vital role in spring preparation as well. They mended sacks for gathering produce, wove baskets for market days ahead, and organized the pantry to make room for fresh stores. Dried herbs were sorted, some saved for seed, others ground into powders for cooking or medicine. As food supplies ran thin, women became masterful at stretching ingredients, sometimes mixing grains with powdered bark or crushed roots to make passable bread. The spiritual calendar also signaled spring's approach. Candlemas, observed on February 2nd, was one of the first festivals to acknowledge the shift in seasons. Villagers brought candles to church to be blessed, symbols of light and protection. It was a day of both ritual and superstition. If the weather was fair, it was believed winter would linger. If stormy, spring would come early. This may sound familiar to modern ears. Echoes of such beliefs live on in traditions like Groundhog Day. Lent followed soon after, ushering in a period of fasting and reflection. Though meat and indulgence were avoided, it was also a practical adaptation. By this point, food supplies were critically low. The church's spiritual discipline aligned with the peasants' reality, turning scarcity into sacred practice. Children, even amid their chores, became spring's early messengers. They would spot the first snowdrops, hear birdsong at dawn, or notice buds on bare branches. These small signs were eagerly shared. The geese are nesting, the bees are moving, the rivers no longer frozen. There was no grand celebration to mark winter's end. Instead, the shift came gradually, humbly, like everything else in peasant life, but it was deeply felt. Muscles, long stiff from indoor labor, loosened in the sun. Spirits lifted. Eyes squinted against the returning brightness, and so the cycle began again. Winter had not broken them. It had tempered them, taught them patience, endurance, and the quiet power of community. Now, with the promise of spring, peasants rose to meet the land once more, ready to sow, to labor, and, hopefully, to thrive. In medieval peasant villages, where books were rare and literacy was scarcer still, knowledge passed not through written words, but through voices, ancient, familiar, and enduring. The elders of the community were the libraries, the historians, the weather forecasters, and the moral compasses. And in the quiet months of winter, when candles burned low and the winds howled at the shutters, their stories wove the past into the present, one word at a time. An elderly woman, rocking by the hearth, might tell of the great frost that once froze the river so solid that a whole ox cart crossed it safely. A stooped grandfather might recall the year a comet streaked the sky and a famine followed. These stories weren't just entertainment. They were warnings, lessons, and comforts. They taught younger generations how to survive the cold, when to plant barley, how to avoid poison mushrooms, or what signs foretold illness. Children clung to these tales, wide-eyed and silent. Stories of saints who healed the sick, of trickster animals who outwitted the mighty, or of ancestors who endured far worse winters were recited with reverence and a hint of theatrical flair. Even adults leaned in, nodding in rhythm with tales they already knew by heart. Because each retelling reaffirmed what mattered: endurance, cunning, community, and faith. This oral tradition was not uniform. Each village, and often each family, had its own way of framing the world. One elder might see the stars as divine portents, another as the souls of the dead. These variations didn't create conflict, rather, they revealed how flexible and personal knowledge could be. Peasants understood that truth came in layers, and often in metaphors. Practical wisdom was equally valued. Elders knew when it was safe to shear sheep, how to treat chilblains using goose grease, which route could calm a restless infant, or how to keep rats out of the grain bin. They knew that snow falling in silence foretold a longer cold snap, while snow with wind signaled a break soon. They understood the behavior of animals, the tone of the sky, the smell of damp earth. Their knowledge was a tapestry of patterns and instincts, passed from one generation's breath to the next. Elders were not always venerated without question. Some were gruff, suspicious, or eccentric, but their place in the village was rarely disputed. A grandmother might not own land or livestock, but if she could bind a wound or bless a child, her worth was secure. An aging shepherd, though no longer strong enough to walk the hills, might still teach boys how to read the sky or soothe a lamb. In the dead of winter, these figures were a balm. As food ran low and morale wore thin, their presence reminded everyone that hardship could be endured, had been endured. They were proof that survival was possible. That warmth came not only from the hearth, but from the stories shared around it. When an elder died, it was not just a life lost, it was a library burned. Villagers mourned not only the person, but the wisdom that went with them. Sometimes a grandchild or neighbor had memorized enough to carry on the stories. But often, entire chapters of folk history vanished into the earth with each burial. Even so, the tradition endured. New elders rose, new tales emerged, and each winter the voices began again. When I was young, your great-grandfather used to say, "There's a tale the old ones told, and it goes like this." In a world without certainty, without insulation or insurance, stories were insulation for the soul. They wrapped the community in memory, meaning, and belonging. And when the winds blew hardest, they held the people together, word by word, breath by breath. As the final frost of winter yielded to the first warmth of spring, medieval peasants did not emerge triumphant or transformed. They emerged alive, and that alone was victory. Survival in their world was not a guarantee. It was a triumph born of habit, humility, and a lifetime of preparation. The coldest nights had tested their bodies, strained their stores, and haunted their sleep. But somehow, each year, most made it through. And in doing so, they left us a legacy far richer than the rough tools and worn stones they left behind. What, then, can we learn from these long-vanished villagers, who braved snow and starvation with no electricity, no central heating, no modern medicine, more than we might think? In their lives are echoes of resilience, resourcefulness, and deep community, qualities that transcend time and technology. First, they planned with purpose. Before the cold arrived, they dried, salted, smoked, pickled, buried, and stored. They didn't wait for a storm to build a shelter. They worked with the seasons, anticipating need rather than reacting to it. Their wisdom came not from innovation, but from repetition, from watching the land and listening to those who came before. There was no margin for waste. Every crumb had a place. Every stitch had meaning. Second, they shared. A peasant family could not isolate themselves through winter without consequence. The community was their true insulation. Whether through labor exchange, food sharing, or communal rituals, they created a safety net stitched from countless small acts. Theirs was a world where strength was found, not in rugged individualism, but in shared burdens and mutual aid. Third, they adapted. Peasants didn't have the luxury of luxury. but they were remarkably creative. When leather ran out, they used reeds. When flour ran low, they mixed bark or beans. When tools broke, they repaired them with whatever was at hand. In every inconvenience, they found a workaround. Not perfect, but sufficient. Not easy, but effective. Fourth, they found meaning in hardship. Faith and folklore wove purpose into their pain. A failed harvest might be God's lesson, a long winter a test of character. Their belief systems, religious and superstitious alike, help them endure suffering not as senseless, but as something to be survived with dignity. They sang, prayed, told stories, and dreamed. Even in darkness, they found ways to make light. And lastly, they remembered. Through oral tradition, they passed on what worked and what didn't, which mushrooms cured fevers, which root soothed the gut, how to read the sky or sense sickness in a sheep. They treated knowledge as sacred because it often meant the difference between life and death. And while much of that lore is lost to time, some still survives in our herbs, our sayings, our instincts. Today, our winters are warmed by furnaces, softened by padded jackets, and made bearable by instant access to food and entertainment. Yet, when systems fail, when storms come or shelves empty, we are reminded, sometimes painfully, how far we've drifted from the wisdom of survival, and how close, still, we stand to the lessons of the past. The medieval peasant didn't live a romantic life. It was often short, brutal, and unjust. But within that harsh existence, they carved out something astonishing, a culture of endurance, one that persisted without wealth, without comfort, without safety nets. And if they could face winter with so little and still greet spring with song, perhaps we too can face our trials with humility, preparation, and hope. Their world may be gone, but their lessons remain, etched in frost, whistled in wind, echoed in every hearth we gather around.